At sea, a migrant ship has sunk off the coast of Africa with 100 feared drowned. New details about the attack on a Maryland newspaper. The shooters plan to kill as many as possible. Another day of violent riots on the Gaza border leaves a 13-year-old boy dead and hundreds injured. And it was a crucial turning point in the lead-up to the 2014 Gaza war. We talked to a member of the elite unit behind the search for the 3 Israeli teens.
From the I24NEWS studios in Times Square in New York, this is Clear Cut with Michelle McCory.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Tal Heinrich in for Michelle McCory tonight. Their situation was desperate. 100 migrants, men, women, and children boarded a boat bound for Europe. Now, most are feared lost at sea. Only 14 have been rescued from the Mediterranean Sea. The bodies of 3 babies have been recovered. The tragedy coming as European leaders reached a tentative agreement on how to handle the flow of migrants from Africa and the Middle East. But not all of the nations are on the same page. I24 News correspondent Marcus White has the latest.
These Libyan migrants embarked on the difficult and dangerous journey across the Mediterranean Sea towards Europe. But on Friday, the European Union-backed Libya Coast Guard intercepted their boat and brought the 345 migrants back to the Libyan capital of Tripoli. Though their plans for a new life were upended, they were some of the lucky ones. In a separate incident, Coast Guard officials say about 100 migrants drowned when their vessel capsized off of Libya's western coast on Friday. 3 babies are among the dead, and just over a dozen were rescued. Libya's western coast is a main point where thousands fleeing poverty and war risk their lives to reach Europe. For about 3 years, Europe has been struggling with how to handle an influx of migrants from Africa and the Middle East. Refugee camps in Italy and France are crowded. Officials say about 56,000 migrants have arrived in Europe so far this year. European Union leaders met in Brussels this week to try and hash out the migration crisis. After all-night discussions on Thursday, the EU struck a deal. The leaders agreed on setting up disembarkation platforms, most likely in North Africa, to discourage migrants from boarding smuggling boats heading to Europe. Under the deal, EU member nations can also elect to set up migrant processing centers to determine whether migrant arrivals should be returned home or admitted as refugees. The agreement also calls for more investment in Africa to help its civilians live a better life. French President Emmanuel Macron is praising the deal.
We did not give in to the worst of expectations. We came back to the facts, to the vital elements of responsibility and solidarity, which must continue to build our Europe. And in doing so, we were able to build, and I think I can say this, a significant agreement, which is just one step forward.
Other EU leaders agree there's still more work to be done.
We are, of course, not at the end of the road, but you can imagine that the perspectives were extremely different under the member states.
Marcus White, I24 News.
Let's bring in Michelle Egan. She's a fellow at the Wilson Center and a professor at American University. Michelle, thank you for joining us. In the EU summit in Brussels, leaders agreed upon the idea of establishing what they call disembarkation platforms in North Africa. The concept is to screen refugees before they start making their journey to Europe. The Czech Prime Minister, by the way, he compared it to Ellis Island. What do you think? Will this work?
This is not a new issue. It was proposed by the British way back in 2003. It's a little bit like what the Australian model does. And the idea is to have the processing of asylum in North Africa, depending on which countries. This is very nice as an idea, but there will be a whole host of issues that the infrastructure in these particular countries, the processing requirements, it's not going to be, it's a good sell in terms of politically and domestically within Europe, but the actual logistics, what will actually happen, and people will be looking in terms of human rights and humanitarian issues as well.
And speaking of domestic politics, European Union leaders are very much divided over migration. You have Italy's anti-immigration government, and in Germany, Angela Merkel faces a political threat if she doesn't find a way to allow Germany to push back asylum seekers from other European Union countries. At the end of the day, these political struggles and divisions are dictating the fate of refugees.
That's absolutely correct. And there's a division between those who are border countries that are getting the influx, sort of Greece or Spain or Italy, versus those that are not the point of first arrival, and that's the more northern countries. So that's one division. And then you have Central and Eastern Europe, who have said very, very specifically that they will not host any of these processing centers within the EU. So the divisions are sort of very, very north-south, east-west, and so this is very difficult. And the thing to note, though, is in terms of asylum applications, they have soared in Germany. So Germany is much more the outlier than some of the other countries. Asylum seeking is high in Sweden and also in Italy, but Germany is the one that's concerned. And so Germany's issue is very different. Germany is concerned about what they call secondary movement, people getting in and getting asylum processed in perhaps Greece or Spain, and then basically transiting through the EU and ending up in Germany. That's an issue. It's a different issue for Germany than it is for, say, Greece or Italy, where there are refugees arriving on their shores.
And that puts Chancellor Angela Merkel in a very tough spot politically, domestically, right?
It does. She's in a coalition with the CSU, and they have been beating the drum of anti-immigrant rhetoric. Having said that, this is sort of her domestic issue. She brought this summit on, and it's a domestic issue that she wanted to resolve because of her coalition. But there are many, many views here, and there was a lot of disagreement. This was a 9-hour summit, and even now, the wording that we're looking at and how this is going to be implemented, this is very, very vague wording. It's an agreement, but the realities will be both costly but also difficult to actually put into practice.
That's why we call it a tentative agreement. There are some in Europe who say most of those coming from Africa are coming for economic reasons and are not refugees. What is your assessment of that?
That's one of the issues I think they want to start thinking about in what these processing centers are. If they get to Europe, how many of them are asylum seekers and have a need for protection, and how many of them are economic migrants? And I think the two are quite different in that regard. And the other issue is Europe has open borders through the Schengen Agreement. Those open borders are a European privilege for Europeans. And so they're really concerned about, their own sort of internal borderless Europe as well, which is being impacted. I mean, we also have to remember we're calling it a migrant crisis, and I think it's a humanitarian crisis, but I also think we are having this summit meeting when the number of people crossing and the number of people who are actually arriving has gone down. You mentioned the terrible boat incident, but we've seen a decrease massively in numbers since 2015, 2016. So the numbers is much lower.
Is there any way to stem the tide of refugees coming to Europe without addressing the root causes?
I think that's what the EU has sort of put a Band-Aid on this EU summit. They have agreed to basically give several $1 billion to Turkey for the resettlement and keeping of migrants in Turkey. They've done the same thing to Libya. They're creating an Africa fund that they hope will actually assist with, economic development aid and development aid to sort of stem the tide of refugees. But, we have refugees from many countries coming for very, very different reasons. Obviously, war-torn countries, persecution, religious persecution. So people are coming for a variety of reasons. So they may not actually be able to or willing to go back.
Michelle Egan from the Wilson Center, thank you for your time. And now you can go answer that phone call.
Thank you. Apologies.
It's fine. All right, coming up on Clear Cut, new details about the deadly shooting at a Maryland newspaper, what we know about the suspect and how he carried out the attack. Plus, the immigration debate. Protesters are scheduled to rally around the country with Congress no closer to a solution. And a crucial election in Mexico, voters going to the polls as tensions rise with the United States. back to CLEARCUT. We're learning more about the suspect accused of killing 5 people at a local newspaper in Maryland. Police say Jared Ramos barricaded the back door before shooting his way through the front. Condolences for the victims and survivors have come in from across the country and from local memorials to a statement from the president. Correspondent Janae Norman has the latest. Janae, you're with us now from Maryland.
The hospital have been released from the hospital. We've learned 2 victims were released from the hospital today, the same day that the Capital Gazette was determined to get a newspaper out covering the story that involves their own. New details about the gunman, armed with a shotgun and smoke grenades, who authorities say targeted a newsroom.
We brought to the judge's attention the evidence that suggested a coordinated attack, the barricading of a back door, and the use of a tactical approach and hunting down and shooting the innocent victims in this case.
The suspect, 38-year-old Jared Ramos, killing 5 people, all who worked for the Capital Gazette newspaper. The victims, Wendy Winters, a special publication editor, editorial page editor Gerald Fishman, sports reporter John McNamara, sales assistant Rebecca Smith, and editor and columnist Rob Hyacin.
This was a targeted attack.
Ramos sued the paper for defamation in 2012 after the Gazette reported on his guilty plea in a stalking case in 2011. The lawsuit was dismissed, but a retired editor for the Gazette says for years Ramos made threats against the paper on social media.
We had actually contacted the police to pursue one particular comment in which he wished me dead.
Police revealing those threats continued until as recently as Thursday, and they'd investigated Ramos before.
In May of 2013, we did have a situation where online threatening comments were made. We had a detective